I'm really delighted to welcome a colleague, a former colleague here at the University of Glasgow, Dr. Briony Wickes, who is now a lecturer in 19th century literature and sustainability in the Department of English at Royal Holloway, University of London. She's a scholar of British literature with expertise in critical animal studies, the environmental humanities, post-colonial and migration studies, and the novel. Before joining Royal Holloway in 2022, it's literally just happened, so some of you will see the previous bio on the website. She held a European Research Council postdoctoral fellowship at University College Dublin and worked as a lecturer in Victorian literature here at the University of Glasgow. She has also taught at King's College London, where she also received her HRC-funded PhD in 2019. Briony's research investigates the relationship between literature and global mobility during a time in which the category of the human is being put increasingly under pressure. She's currently completing a monograph project entitled Animal Materials, Ecology, Settlement, and the Novel 1815-1910. This book makes the case that 19th century fiction entwines the central logics of settler colonialism, the distinct form of colonialism that aims to permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous territory, with the science and substances of animal life. Reading novels by Charles Dickens, Mary Shelley, Olive Schreiner, Elizabeth Gaskell, and H.G. Welsh, the book aims to show how animal bodies become a conduit for representing the tensions of mass migration and identifies the interactive imaginaries of race and species within Victorian texts. You can see all the resonances here with the text we're looking at this weekend. She has work published and forthcoming in literature and history, international migrations in the Victorian era, commodities of literature, and the Palgrave Handbook to European migration in literature and culture. So I'm really looking forward to this keynote. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you, Briony, and welcome you.
I'm really delighted to be here. As Dimitri said, I'm a 19th century studies scholar by trade, so it's been really nice to read a book published after 1910 for a change. And I'm delighted to be sharing my paper, Chewing the Cud, Rabbits, Reingestion and Life Among the Ruins, in Richard Adams's Watership Down. And so by chewing the cud, in part, I mean that I'm going to be ruminating like a rabbit with you all today about species being in Watership Down, to chew through and think carefully about what rabbits mean in this novel, how the matter of the rabbit materially and conceptually gets written into this text. But by titling this paper Chewing the Cud and evoking the repetitive munching of rabbits and other ruminators, I also want to draw attention to some of the significant cyclical patterns in the novel. For many of us, when we think about Watership Down, we probably remember it as a quest narrative, a forward movement from Sandalford Warren to the promised lands of Watership Down. In this talk, however, I want to examine the novel's systemic imagination, how it depends upon and puts forward a series of closed loops, efficient natural systems, in which it finds a sense of balance and a promise of a more secure future. So here I argue the narrative intersects with nascent neoliberal tensions, fantasies, and anxieties, emerging in the 1970s that sought to ensure the continued growth of life on Earth at a time when it was becoming increasingly clear that the planet is nearing its material limits. So 50 years ago, in 1972, the same year that Watership Down appeared, the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth World Report appeared, a crisis document that used modelling techniques to predict world futures, which suggested that the time of expansion was over and that humanity would soon find itself restricted by the finite nature of Earth's resources. So as Melinda Cooper has argued, this was a crisis that could not be measured in conventional economic terms, but it was, quote, a whole-scale crisis in the realm of reproduction. Alongside shortfalls to growth, it also raised potentials for a myriad of future ecological dangers: pollution, famine, species extinction. What was at stake, Cooper argues, was no less than the continuing reproduction of the Earth's biosphere and hence the future of life on Earth. So if the Western world wished to continue developing, expanding, and enjoying the good life as it currently was, things needed to change, and fast. And indeed, Cooper identifies this historical period as the moment in which relations to world systems more broadly and to the sphere of life itself began to shift. So she traces two co-entangled genealogies. Firstly, you get massive investments in the life sciences as the Western world sought to maintain and optimize levels of production. And you also get the emergence of neoliberalism as our dominant political philosophy, in which, following Michel Foucault and Wendy Brown, we can say that the economy is detached from sort of an exclusive association with production or the circulation of goods, and it's extended into areas that seem unrelated to the economy, such as education, health, fitness, family life, or neighbourhood. So both of these histories, Cooper argues, share a common obsession with overcoming earthly limits. They sought in their various ways to galvanise the productive capabilities of life. But to do so, they depend on modes of speculation. They're intimately connected to financial systems of speculation, debt creation, and investment, but also in the sense that they mobilise future-oriented imaginaries to help us think our way out of contemporary ecological predicaments, and perhaps even beyond earthly imposed barriers. So as Cooper puts it, when capitalism confronts the geochemical limits of the earth, where does it move? And in my paper today, I want to suggest that perhaps one of the places it might move to is Watership Down. So now these entangled genealogies of economic growth and ecological instability may seem worlds apart from the rolling hills of a beloved book about rabbits. And indeed, it's actually really tempting to go the opposite way, to read Watership Down as a retreat into the past rather than a narrative deeply concerned about the future, a nostalgic escape into pastures lost. But as Raymond Williams argues in another landmark text that also came out during this period, The Country and the City, which appears in 1973, a great couple of years for books, narratives of the English countryside are always entangled with histories of capital and class struggle, as well as with the reproduction of social orders. And to miss that is to miss out on much of the rich thickness of such narratives. So animals do not feature in Williams's cultural analysis, and so perhaps by turning to Watership Down, we can gain a better sense of the integral place of non-human life in these histories of neoliberalism and its speculative futures. So, as I'm going to argue in what follows, Watership Down is a novel deeply concerned with the limits of life on Earth and with the regeneration of living futures, perhaps maybe even beyond established limits. And I'm also going to make the case that it puts its faith in rabbits. So, in rabbits, the novel identifies the regenerative imaginary that it sorely needs in a moment of historical ecological anxiety, by the capacity of this species to thrive and multiply despite having, quote, 1,000 enemies, and despite living in increasingly deforested and damaged environments. But also the rabbit's social and spatial organisation, and indeed the rabbit body itself, is depicted in the text as an efficient biological looping system through the process of regeneration and reingestion, or chewing the cud. So to make this argument, I'm going to be drawing on theoretical work in the field of animal studies, particularly by key theorists such as Kerry Wolfe, Jacques Derrida, and Nicole Shukin. So in the last 20 years, animal studies has put increasing pressure on the lines of division between humans and other animals, challenging the very notion of human exceptionalism and exploding the binary between nature and culture. So animal studies scholars seek to reveal the ways in which life on Earth is not a solely human history, but is inextricably tied to the material lives of animals. So they examine how the category of species emerges within various social discourses, and in turn, how that idea of species is imbricated with culturally constructed categories of difference, such as race, ability, class, and gender. So it's a really exciting field to work in, but at times, if you'll excuse the pun, it's easy to fall down a rabbit hole. I don't know if anyone has found this when they've been researching Watership Down, But once you start looking for them, rabbits are everywhere. From the Bible to Bugs Bunny, you'll keep finding them and you won't be able to get away. So this perhaps gives a sense of what Kerry Wolfe calls animal studies' daunting interdisciplinarity, but also some of its challenges. In an overview of the field, she discusses the potential of animal studies, but also some of its pitfalls. Animal studies, if it is to be something other than mere thematics, fundamentally challenges the schema of the knowing subject and its anthropocentric underpinnings, sustained and reproduced in the current disciplinary protocols of cultural studies, not to mention literary studies. So here, Wolfe is arguing that too often animal studies piggybacks on a cultural studies model. It extends the sphere of academic consideration to non-human animals, but in a way that reproduces ideologically familiar modes of subjectivity based on liberal humanist thought. So this is the logic that says animals deserve rights because they're just like us, but a less good version, so we should take care of them. And this is a really nice, important sentiment. I'm not saying here we should be cruel to animals by any stretch of the imagination, but as Wolfe reminds us, sometimes this approach ends up reasserting the very hierarchies or anthropocentric modes of thinking that it sets out originally to dismantle. Indeed, he argues animal studies scholarship ought to challenge the schema of the knowing subject by attending to the specialness of individual species, their agencies, the finitudes that we share with them, their knowledges, and importantly, their differences. So, as Derrida argues, it is asinine, bêtise in French, to think only about the animal in the singular. To do so is to put animals in a generic cage, as if they're all the same. It doesn't theoretically make sense, but it's also a violent gesture that leads to the devaluation of species life. So in literary studies, this requires scholars to ask, what does species mean? As Philip Armstrong puts it in his wonderful title, in literature and culture, beyond whatever kind of values humanity has projected onto them. So to work against a tradition that has typically seen animals in text as symbols or metaphors. And to do so means attending again to the specificities of species. Watership Down would be a very different beast if it were written about dogs or cats or llamas. But it also means avoiding only reading animals as an expression of anthropomorphism. These readings are interesting, but there are many more readings that we can make. As a genre, talking animal stories, so animal autobiographies or biographies, are often particularly in danger of being read as nothing more than allegory, often because animals appear to be ventriloquizing human thoughts and ideas. So one of the most famous examples of the genre, Anna Sewell's Black Beauty from 1877, has been read as a novel about the historical oppression of women or working class communities, or about a sort of representation for the history of slavery. And again, these readings are fascinating, valid, and illuminating, but how do they shift if we take talking animals seriously and consider that they're stories about animals? So one of my favorite Black Beauty facts is that the original frontispiece, Sewell describes herself not as an author, but as a translator. And I love this idea that somewhere out there, there's a Black Beauty text written in equine, and it's inaccessible to readers who never know what's actually in it. But even if you don't care about horses or rabbits or any animals, there are significant ideological reasons for taking other species at their word. By only reading animals as symbols for human concerns, we do not adequately deal with the kinds of discourses and structures that permit violence in the first place, violence that gets wielded against humans and animals alike. As Derrida argues, violence towards animals, or what he calls the, quote, non-criminal putting to death of other species, end quote, is countenanced in a collective social agreement that it's okay to kill animals. In turn, as Wolfe argues, as long as it's institutionally taken for granted that it's all right to systematically exploit and kill non-human animals simply because of their species, then the humanist discourse of species will always be available for use by some humans against other humans to countenance violence against the social other of whatever sort. So there's much to be gained and much at stake by reading the rabbits of Watership Down as precisely that, as rabbits. And indeed, Adams appears to encourage us to do so. In his interviews after the novel's publication, he writes, "I can't stress too strongly that Watership Down is not a sociological fable or a political allegory. I suggest to you that if Hazel and Bigwig and the others were only meant to be symbols of something else, they wouldn't be so real as they are." And in another interview, "I didn't choose rabbits any more than one chooses what is going to dream about." So this second quotation I find really interesting, and I also should note I've taken these interviews from Joan Bridgman's PhD thesis, which was a fabulous resource. But it's the second quotation I'm particularly interested in because although it may seem like the choice of rabbits is abstract or random, just as you can't control the complex whirl of meaning that enters your mind when you dream, you also can't entangle rabbits from the proliferating meanings and material and conceptual that are attached to them. So when rabbits appear in fiction, they're a complex knot of ideas. They're informed by real rabbits and our actual experiences with them, but they're also mediated by weighty and shifting cultural histories, rabbit lore and rabbit fantasies. So I don't want to delve too deeply into that here, but to just gesture towards a very brief example where we can see this happening clearly, are the references to Brer Rabbit in the novel. So a rabbit figure taken from traditional stories belonging variously to Native American communities and also to Black cultures, repackaged by Joel Chandler Harris for white audiences in 19th century America, remade by Disney, and then reimagined loosely here in The Adventures of Watership Down. So Brer Rabbit is a good example of how animals accrue meanings across different forms of cultural production, but also how these meanings must be located within specific historical contexts. And the cultural conceptualizations of animals are always inextricable from broader socio-political relations that straddle species divides. So, always historicize, to quote Frederick Jameson. Against a tradition that has read animals as universal symbols for enduring human truths, we must attend to their particularities in Watership Down and identify the specific cultural logics that subtend their representations. So Adams' novel, as mentioned at the beginning of this talk, emerges during a moment of economic, political, and ecological instability in the 1970s, what environmental historians have termed the threshold period of environmentalism. So during this time, activists and scientists alike addressed issues of air and water pollution, nuclear power, atomic waste, chemical poisoning, and the use of pesticides. And society at large also saw the wobbling of other social and political thresholds: Cold War conflicts, growing Indigenous activism, the rise of spectacular new scientific and technological innovations, and a growing consciousness of global interdependence. Life was pushing at the limits. And one imaginary that we see emerging in response to this age of capacity is the figure of spaceship Earth, which really begins to take hold in the 1960s, although it's present before then, which is an ideal in which humanity works as a global community on board a planet as spacecraft, united by a common dependence on the fragile biodiversity of our planet. So Watership Down, I'm going to argue, also narrativizes this shift towards the world as community sharing a common destiny, but it does so with and alongside rabbits. This is not to say that other species are excluded from the imaginative models put forward by Spaceship Earth. Its discourses drew on 20th century systems ecology, which reinvented the environment as one large life support system. But as Leah Aronofsky has shown, Spaceship Earth's conceptual models did not simply extol the mastery of other species, but conversely revealed humanity's vital dependence upon non-human modes of being. So Aronofsky offers the history of an algae-based bioregenerative life support system developed by NASA during this period. This system proposed a spaceship cabin design in which simple organisms, most commonly algae, would inhabit the spacecraft and through a series of interspecies symbioses, maintain cabin conditions and sustain astronaut life. These botanical life forms would recycle human waste products into nutrients, photosynthesize toxic gases into vital ones, and hydrolyze urine and sweat into potable water and the stuff of high modernist space punk alchemic dreams. So this system was never actually put into practice, although my understanding is that NASA spent a lot of money on it. But its speculative and historical possibilities nevertheless resonate here, turning the spacecraft into the site of interdependency that depends on non-human life. Bumping up against the natural barriers of Earth, life-sustaining technologies must develop around the uniqueness of other species. And there's a lot of hope here that sort of underlines these imagined systems. NASA is putting its faith in algae and their vital potential, things they have that no other species seem to. Its promise of infinite regeneration, in turn, will permit continued expansion. So Watership Down, I argue, encrypts similar tensions and fantasies, but it relocates them to the countryside through its explorations of the contractions, expansions, and the loops of rabbit life. So, as an animal autobiography about rabbits, instability is hardwired into the novel's DNA. There's a curious tension that appears throughout the text. Rabbits, we are told, are a species on the constant edge of decline through both natural and unnatural causes, under threat from human and animal enemies, from myxomatosis, and from the destruction of their warrens, and from competition with other rabbits. And yet, as many of us know and think about when we think about rabbits, they're also natural and swift multipliers. So as Holly tells us, our warren, the Threra's warren, and struggle with some of these Latin terms, was overcrowded a year or two back. The Threra told me that not long ago, El Herrera made a bargain with Frith. Frith promised him that rabbits were not to be born dead or unwanted. So rabbit life in Watership Down is permanently on the edge of catastrophe, and it's also infinitely capable of regeneration. So this notion is explored through the depiction of the various warrens in the novel, for example. Many critics have sort of looked at the warren as a space where the individual talents of a rabbit can emerge, but it's also undeniably a collective endeavour. It's interconnecting networks of tunnels and entrances, burrows and shallow troughs. The warren is a complex social and spatial apparatus that, like those regenerative techno-scientific systems imagined under the banner of Spaceship Earth, require balance and maintenance. And a warren out of order is a terrible thing indeed. Consider, for example, that famous moment, I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about it, when Holly recants the tale of the human's destruction of Sandalford, for example. Very soon, the runs were crammed with rabbits clawing and clambering over each other. They went up the runs they were accustomed to use and found them blocked. Some managed to turn around, but they couldn't get back because of the rabbits coming up. And then the runs began to be blocked lower down with dead rabbits, and the live rabbits tore them to pieces. So this is harrowing and apocalyptic. I'm sorry for sharing it on a Saturday morning. One of the most upsetting passages in the book. But perhaps one of the reasons why it is so horrifying and terrifying is that it's a vision of a system gone wrong, represented spatially. So entranceways are blocked, rabbits are trying to turn around, they're getting stuck. There are these sort of narrow tunnels and one-way passages that are getting sort of full with the bodies of dead companions. But also we see the system going wrong socially. So rabbits are turning on one another and they're tearing each other to pieces. So the warren at Ephrata is another example of a failing system. It's also described as such. In fact, throughout the text, I think it's described as a system. General Woundwort came, he had made the move to Ephrata, and he'd worked out this whole system of concealment and perfected it. But the trouble is, there are more rabbits now than the warren can hold. Any fresh digging that's allowed has to be done under ALSA supervision, and they do it terribly slowly and carefully. It all has to be hidden, you see. We're overcrowded, and a lot of rabbits don't get above ground as much as they need to, but no one is ever allowed to leave. Things can't go on like this. The system's breaking down. But I don't even need to explain, except so in the final sentence. So as scholars have noted, Woundwort's warren failed because he's an overbearing, inflexible tyrant. But he's also really inefficient, interfering with the balance of rabbit life and rabbit practices, including digging and mating. He's also a resource hoarder. He's stockpiling does, but he's not willing to develop or alter his system to account for overcrowding and the need for more space. He's too cautious, he's too slow. Life at its limits will overtake him. So here then is his inherent problem. As he bumps up against natural barriers, he's perfected a system that was once productive, but it's overexceeded itself, and it now has nowhere else to go. And his refusal to cooperate with Hazel, his resistance to change, the way he dogmatically sticks to an old way of life, ventriloquizes the attitudes of some of the industrialists, politicians, and economists who, on hearing the predictions of the Club of Rome 1972 World Futures Report, dismissed it as Malthusian hyperbole. So as the narrative makes clear, things can't go on like this, the system's breaking down. So new models of social, spatial, and ecological organisation are needed, and they are found in the warren at Watership Down. So I don't want to go on too much about the social organisation of Hazel's warren, but I do want to emphasise that it's designed to be sustainable. Everyone has a place, and they work together in unison. And by the end of the text, it's also largely a self-sufficient order, something the rabbits work hard to achieve over the course of the narrative. And emblematic of its general holistic nature, the rabbits christen their collective meeting place, which again is a fairly novel invention, not typically found in just any old warren, a sort of representative of these new ideas and technologies. They christen it the honeycomb, evoking cultural associations with another efficient non-human species, bees who've featured in political theory from antiquity to the present as the model of industriousness and of a perfect social organisation. And indeed, honeycomb, with its mass of prismatic cells in perfect geometric order, is likewise an image of beauty and also natural harmony, a sort of interconnected looping patterns, although I guess they're looping in a hexagonal way. So leaving aside the elegant social organisations and beautiful honeycomb structures, I now want to turn to something perhaps a little more rough for a Saturday morning, but what I feel is one of the novel's clearest expressions of regeneration and this faith in renewability, and that's reingestion, the eating of feces or dung. So, rabbits, as I mentioned in the opening of this talk, chew the cud. It's actually mentioned in the Bible, in Leviticus 11:6. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof, is unclean for you. So rabbits eat their excrement. They re-ingest the grass taken into the digestive tract while feeding in the early evening. The grass is formed into soft pellets, which the rabbit then removes from its anus later, either underground in the burrow or above ground. And after reingestion, the material reappears as hard pellets, which are excreted always above ground. Very briefly, that's the difference. Again, apologies, I know it's early in the morning. And up until the 20th century, although it does appear in the Bible, the phenomena of reingestion as a rabbit thing was not generally known, but it does appear in The Private Life of the Rabbit by Ronald Lockley. And Lockley speculates that the reason that reingestion is not generally known is because it is indeed a fairly private matter for the rabbit. It could easily be overlooked by the casual observer, a swift bending of the head during which the long ears almost touch the ground between the hind legs. Then the rabbit's head would come up and the jaws work for a few seconds as the pellet was swallowed. The observer could not see the feces because of the masking action of the closed mouth. So Lockley, though, was not just a casual observer. He had set up artificial warrens and he was watching these poor rabbits 24 hours a day. And he'd noticed this phenomena and decided to share it with the public. And I'm really glad that he did. And Adams also appears to have been fascinated by this information in an interview. Again, thank you, Joan Bridgman, for collating these. In 1972, he says, "They're astonishing people, rabbits, you know. They're ruminatory, like a cow. Their grass is twice eaten. They chew it first into little pellets and then pick it out of their anuses. Thank you." This to the secretary, who brought in some tea. Not that they're excrement, you understand. Sugar? Pellets of grass, which the rabbits then chew. It's a very comfortable thing. They sit on a nice sunny bank and chew their pellets. Yes. The loveliest way to talk about it. So, determined to present a real picture of rabbit life in Watership Down, Adams includes this practice within the narrative, using the Latvian term haraka. Haraka one end, jokes the other, as Bluebell puts it. So the inclusion of reingestion in the novel is comic. It's that sort of aside, perhaps, to adult readers of the text, when we sort of knowingly smile and nod to ourselves. There's a brilliant moment, for example, when Bigwig tells Woundwort to siffle cracker, and we all know what that means. So usually excrement in fiction, Susan Morrison has argued in her work on waste aesthetics, it's intended to evoke division, alienation, disgust. Certain communities are designated as waste or trash. A body can waste away. Yet in Watership Down, to pass haraka has no such negative connotations. In a narrative which explores unpredictability, and the various upheavals of rabbit life, haraka is as certain as the passing of time. But there is grass that must be eaten, pellets that must be chewed, haraka that must be passed, holes that must be dug, and sleep that must be slept. So in turn, not being able to pass haraka is shown to be damaging to rabbit health and happiness. The rabbits of Ephrata, for example, are often prevented from passing haraka, kept underground and only allowed out at certain times of the day. There's even a haraka sentry who controls and coordinates this process. If the general finds any haraka in the fields, he'll stuff your tail down your throat. And so here in this bottom quote, we get an image of the rabbit body backwards and upended, with tail in mouth rather than cud. So General Woundwort's strict policies on haraka can be linked to other modes of overconsumption in the warren. His resources hoarding, his hoarding of doughs. It's heaving, his warren stuffed, it's bloated, it's stuck. In short, it's constipated. Importantly, haraka illuminates the interdependence of bodily systems and their environment, and the need to maintain ecological equilibriums in order for both things to go on. Ingesting grass, which is taken into the stomach, digested, excreted, re-ingested, processed again, and then once more excreted, haraka presents a body in perfect order, a body that loops, constant renewal, but it's also charged with vital potential. So here we might think of theoretical work on new materialism, of Jane Bennett's work on vibrant matter, that sees waste products as having their own kind of vibrant potential. Paraka is waste material recycled and reconverted into dynamic energy, into productive new possibilities. Paraka, in short, is hope. So, I just sort of want to wind this talk up now by thinking through the complex burdens of hope within the narrative. As I've suggested, Watership Down is inherently an environmentally conscious text. It really cares about ecology, its rabbits, and the maintenance of the environment. But its ecological imagination, emerging when it does, is necessarily informed by the neoliberalization of nature, the development of bioregenerative fantasies, the hope of the renewing new. It suggests that we can not only continue to live in the capitalist ruins of the earth, but that we might even be able to thrive. Perhaps we can find new ways to live bigger and better. And here I want to draw attention to what the animal studies theorist Nicole Shupin calls the multi-species common. So broadly, she uses this term to articulate the ways that increasingly humans living under a system of global capitalism and at a time of imminent ecological collapse, humans are increasingly turning to animals for salvation, economically, but also, in a sense, spiritually. And in turn, she thinks about how animals become participants in neoliberal structures. So she gives the example of cat cafes, for example, operating as a kind of way of accessing touch and a sort of effective animal labour that we might be lacking in present society. Or she thinks about military working dogs being awarded medals for their enterprising spirit, being kind of collaborators in kind of military endeavours. So Shupin's focus in the multi-species common really is on the present moment. So the contexts do differ to what we're working with in Watership Down, but I do think this notion of the multi-species common, the saving grace, not yet, the saving grace of animals, as she puts it, does reinforce how we do turn to animals in times of crises, but also how we turn to them for love, for hope, for companionship, but often also to optimize their unique capabilities, the things that they offer us. So one of the ways that Watership Down imagines exceeding the limits to growth, overcoming the instabilities it identifies, is the multi-species nature of the new warren. So Hazel and friends do not survive and thrive on rabbit cunning alone, but they recognize the potential of their species others, so mice, birds, foxes, even humans. The novel puts all of these different creatures to work in new ways at the end of the text, and so opens life's energies to new forms of speculation. And yet, I'm going to just close with one moment where the innovation of rabbits actually breaks these series of closed systems. They escape the loop. Another example of Watership Down, systemic imagination, I didn't have time to focus on, but I think it's really interesting, is viral systems through its engagement with myxomatosis, the white blindness in the text. So Lockley, whose research on rabbits was focused on working out how myxomatosis spread amongst rabbit populations, was initially baffled by this virus. And in the private life of rabbits, he talks about how his various experiments to infect certain populations failed because he'd misunderstood how rabbits interact. He was wrong. Mixie is not spread by social interactions alone, but by fleas in the ears. So particular rabbits have to have these fleas, and this took him ages to work out, almost embarrassing. In Watership Down, El Herrera also discovers this, and he's told by the black rabbit. It is carried by a flea in rabbit's ears, said the black rabbit. They pass from the ears of a sick rabbit to those of his companion. But El Herrera, you have no ears, and fleas will not go to dock leaves. You can neither catch nor carry the white blindness. So without ears, El Herrera cannot catch myxomatosis. The cycle of the virus and the way that it moves through the community is broken. And he is re-energized by this discovery. He leaps up and is renewed with a fresh sense of confidence. So replacing his ears with dock leaves, we get a startling image of a rabbit body transformed, a rejection perhaps of that kind of image of the perfect looping rabbit body that I discussed earlier with reingestion. In turn, we are reminded that though we may turn to them in moments of crisis, and though we might design future-oriented fantasies around them, rabbits and other animals might not necessarily cooperate with us. They may, in fact, have other tricks up their sleeves. Thank you.
Wow, right. Absolutely brilliant stuff today. Okay, questions. I think I might have to do I have to do the mic thing. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to have to carry.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Briony. That was an absolutely brilliant talk.
Oh.
Wonderful to hear. I had a question about another system that you didn't mention in the book, which is the system of the cowslips warren, which also is a collaborative system involving humans, and I don't think there are other animals involved. But I wondered whether you had anything to say about the relationship between that system and the Watership Down.
Is this one?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Thank you very much. I hadn't thought too much about it, I have to say. I suppose you have to remember, which one is cowslips warren?
That's the first.
The first one?
The snares.
The snares, yes, okay. Well, I think definitely then that, that is a warren where obviously there is this kind of, I suppose almost breaking the system with the snares. And again, those ideas that that rabbits will continue to regenerate, they will continue to be caught in the traps, that they can continue to provide various resources for the humans. And I suppose one of the interesting things that I was thinking about when I was looking at all the different warrens is the ways that the warren itself, although in Watership Down it seems fairly natural, and I thought it was a natural thing, was originally, sort of is a term that humans have created, is a kind of a designation where it's humans who have created this notion of the warren as both a kind of place where rabbits live and a social sort of organisation. So I suppose that's one of the things that I found quite interesting, again, is that we've got this idea of the warren. In my mind, it's just this lovely natural system that emerges from the earth that rabbits have organised, but that actually the way we think about warrens has always been shaped by humans and their interventions into rabbit life.
I was just thinking that maybe it might be quite interesting comparison to make in terms of the idea of late capitalism, that in a way that warren might have been invented as a model of late capitalism against which Watership Down then constructs itself. But I think, yeah, I think your response is absolutely right. Thank you so much. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to respond to capitalism?
Sure. Yeah, and I think one of the really, again, interesting things that I did find about Watership Down that I really wanted to communicate here is that very often we do think of these relations as sort of violent and exploitative, but that often, as I hope I've kind of shown in Watership Down, that they can they can happen in ways that seem really uplifting and caring, and that depend on notions of companionship and care and joy, but those can still be used to create exploitative, extractive systems. So I agree. I think actually it would be a really interesting comparison. I should certainly go in. Yes.
One of the things that I really liked about your analysis was appreciating the diversity of animals and how we shouldn't see the animals as the unitary. I think it's interesting in Watership Down to contrast it with a lot of other animal stories where different species are really allegorical and they represent good and bad. So there are good species and there are bad species. There's the big bad wolf and the 3 little pigs and things like that. And what Adams did is he showed that within rabbits, just one kind of animal, you can have the good and the bad, and there can be some freedom of choice to move between them. And I thought that was entirely novel.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, again, I think one of the brilliant things about working on animals in particular is because often we see animals as like universal, kind of outside of our culture, they have this kind of capaciousness to them, as you're saying, that they can be all these different things. And because they are so capacious, and because we do think of them as being natural and universal symbols, they do often end up getting co-opted by various political parties, kind of nationalist agendas. I've been thinking a little bit about, sort of the beaver for the Canadian fur trade, which seems just like a nice natural symbol, but it encodes that kind of history of settler colonialism and the fur trade and all the violence that went with that. It's all in there, in that image of the beaver, but then it's also kind of, because it's not represented in any other way than the animal, it seems, again, uplifting or sort of like a symbol of national pride. So again, it's the mimetic capaciousness of animals that I find really exciting. It doesn't mean you can ever find new meanings that are attached to all sorts of different animals. It's endless.
It was too early. Thanks, Briony. That was really, really interesting. And there are lots of questions I could ask, actually. But I'm going to go for one that's particularly my area of interest, anthropomorphism. And I was really interested the way you were gesturing towards the limitations of when we consider these books in terms of anthropomorphism. And of course, it struck me as you spoke of the examples you gave, it is so difficult for us to ever escape humans speaking about animals as hard as we try. Believe me, I've tried to escape the human to talk about animals. It's, as you know, really, really tough. But I think one of the essays I've read that works so hard to do that, you mentioned Derrida's great work, I think, thinking about the relationship between animals and humans. I just wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that, because you offered us a glimpse of Derrida's thinking, but its relationship to your own work and the conclusions you drew, because I think there's great potential there for just temporarily breaking away from that really difficult relationship, or the impossibility of ever breaking away from the human. I think he does give us theoretically some little moments of opening that up. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Absolutely. So the Derrida text is fantastic. And I suppose, and you're right, the thing is, we're reading books written by humans. So
absolutely,
the animal that appears in them is always going to be mediated by the human. So again, it's impossible to sort of disentangle our own human thoughts and feelings and emotions from the text, and it is really impossible. I think for me that one of the most interesting things that Derrida offers us is he draws on that the famous quote by Jeremy Bentham, I'm going to misquote it here, but it's the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And in one hand, Bentham is sort of asking this to probe whether kind of animals have similar emotions and feelings as humans do, and he's trying to relate to the animal in a fairly human-centered way. But I think what Derrida does is he takes that question and he thinks about it in the way that, do you think of an animal as a being that reacts or a being that responds? Does an animal just simply kind of react to painful stimuli, or does it like anticipate? Does it try to subvert? Can we think of ways in which animals respond? They become the knowing subject. I've drawn the Carey Wolf quote that I used. And I think sometimes shifting the way that we think about animals rather than just being passive beings that react, thinking about them as beings that respond, also draws attention to some of the things we share with animals, which is obviously vulnerability. We're all going to die. Sorry. Yes. But also, another thing that Derrida draws our attention to, and I think there's going to be a paper on it, so I'm really excited about it, but language, that we all depend on systems of communication that are ahuman, they outlast us, they exist before us. Animals too have their own kind of systems of communication that are beyond them. So it's in these moments where you shift how you look at the human-animal relation and look for moments of connection, but also difference. And I think the Derrida text really offers us. Yes.
Thank you very much. That was really, really well written paper. I had a question that you may not be able to answer, so it comes with that kind of thing that you don't have to feel bad if you can't answer. But it's a species question. In the Herrera mix, we constantly have King Darcy and Prince Rainbow.
Yeah.
What species are they?
Oh gosh. Now you're right. This is a question that I am going to struggle with. And actually, I think one of the reasons that I'm really excited to present this work to this particular group is I've worked on H.G. Wells, but I've certainly never worked on folklore, animals in myth. Really that kind of the way that the fantasy genre uses animals. So I always approach these very, I guess, realist versions of animals. So yeah, I'm interested actually to kind of hear more from the group today, because again, I think the ways that they, the ways that the sort of El Herrera adventures are also interwoven into the narrative. Sorry, now I'm just thinking about my own argument. It does also break the kind of flow of the narrative and its patterns. So again, there's these interesting disruptions coming from these sort of spiritual animals that, yeah, I think I'd really like to think more about, and I hadn't, and now you just made me think about it. So thank you very much.
Good question.
Yeah.
I have to say, when I came this morning, I didn't expect the talk to focus on like a close reading of food, but I loved it. Thank you so much. So my question is not to do with food. It's to do with. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about how the two kind of bad warrens, the Evergreen warren and Cowslips warren.
Yeah.
We could possibly read them both as being unnatural, partly because of like a connection to humans.
Yeah.
So with Cowslips warren, of course, they're being kind of overfed by humans. I can't remember if this is a part of the novel, but in the 2018 BBC series, the Evergreen warren is actually within like the ruins of some old building or something, which I think was such an interesting touch to kind of convey that sort of corruption is kind of taking too much influence from human society. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's definitely those kind of associations with humans, or again, that idea of human intervention in those warrants. And I suppose when I was sort of also, I wonder if again it's something to do with like ideas of resources and extraction. Because one of the things I also noticed is, you know, when the humans come in, they're always smoking their white sticks, which is obviously tobacco, and those kinds of larger systems of extraction. So I wonder if it's something to do with less human intervention, but more these kinds of relentless extractive relationships. Because there are moments where humans intervene, you know, for example, in saving Hazel, or, you know, when they get the boat, which is obviously like a human technology, where it feels like the rabbits are almost, again, sort of drawing on the capacities of humans to help them in a way that's represented positively. So again, I think I would need to spend a bit more time really unpicking it, because it is so rich and complex. But there's definitely, as you suggest, a sort of comparison, I think, that Adams or the novel is asking us to make between the different warrens, how they're organised and how they relate to other species, definitely.
I think we have one more. Take the okay, it's sort of double question, so I kind of cheeky. One's a very simple, factual question about food. And one's a little bit more up in the air. But food question. So two things come out of rabbits' penises. They sort of half digested food, they then reingest, and then the fully digested finished product. Are they both haraka?
Interesting.
Okay, but why are you thinking about that? and if not, which one is? Is there a name for the other one? Second one is, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but so I was just thinking about the fact that, as I understand it anyway, rabbits, of course, are not a native species to Britain, and so their very presence in the landscape is, in a sense, already the product of human intervention. And that for the first 100 years or so of their existence on this island, they were entirely living the life of, I guess, cowslip. So cowslip is the rabbit life in this country, and whereas it's framed entirely as being abnormal and unnatural. So I just want to throw that over to you.
That's fascinating. No, that's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so to the pre question first, I would say in the text, haraka is probably the finished product, because very often, again, something I didn't have space to kind of think about, and I want to think through a little bit more, is one of the ways, for example, the rabbits are able to discover the Efrafal warren is they notice that there's haraka around, and that's why General Woodward is so uptight about it. It reveals that there's rabbits nearby, and that's how hunters and poachers know that there's a rabbit warren nearby. So I would say that the haraka is the kind of finished product, which in turn is as you saw on the image, is this kind of like lovely symbol of a kind of vital whole pellet that has been renewed and recycled. The question about kind of rabbits as a non-native species, again, I think is so interesting. I'm really delighted we've got a whole conference to talk about this book, because again, as Dimitra mentioned in the introduction, I work on animals in other spaces, particularly animals that are taken over usually by Britons in the 19th century, like sheep in Australia and New Zealand. So rabbits, and the way that they are a species that again has been subject to kind of human intervention and these kind of like declines and sort of expansions and ways that humans, myxomatosis being introduced in order to control the population and then getting out of control. I think one of the interesting things I noticed in the Lockley text, which I read and was great actually, I don't know how accurate it always is as a scientific piece, I have to say I'm not a rabbit scientist. One of the things I noticed in Lockley is that he was very adamant that if you leave rabbits alone, once they've been introduced, they kind of just regulate themselves as a species. And it's only when humans come and start over poaching them or spreading myxomatosis around the place that then you get these kind of collapses and huge, right. So I think that was one of the things I also found interesting again when we're thinking about the rabbit as this species that's always teetering on the edge of collapse, but also seems to be entangled with this idea, a human idea that we can just keep producing more rabbits, they'll keep appearing out of the ground if we let them interfere with them. Great, thank you very much.
We are out of time now. We're eating into our tea and coffee time, so I'm going to stop it here. But I'm sure discussions can continue during the break. Please join me in thanking Dr. Briony Wickes.